two types of voice that are commonly used in Korean are active voice and passive voice. And we also have them in English. For example, an active sentence could be, I kicked the ball. And a passive sentence could be, the ball was kicked. So passive can be used to emphasize whatever is being affected in a sentence, whereas active emphasizes the person or thing that does that action. And they both have different uses as well as in Korean, so make sure to learn passive voice before we start. Today's lesson is going to be about something called double passive verbs. That's where you already have a passive verb and you make it passive again. Before we get started with this, I need to be clear that double passive verbs are completely wrong in Korean. And the verbs themselves don't really exist. They're just common mistakes. But with that said, just because something's a mistake, that doesn't mean lots of people aren't going to use it. And in English, for example, the word all right is supposed to be two words, always, but you'll still see a lot of people, including myself, writing it as one word. And this is another example of something that's a common mistake, but is very common in Korean, so you should be aware of what it is. So then what are double passive verbs? Well, many verbs in Korean can become passive by conjugating them and attaching 지다 to the end. Let me show you a couple examples. The verb 주다, meaning to give, can become passive as 주어지다, to be given. So you could say, the present that was given to me by my father was a slingshot, or something like that. And 만들다, to make, can become passive as 만들어지다. So you can say, I bought a box made of, literally that was made of, passive, wood. However, this is only what happens to some action verbs. However, descriptive verbs can also attach this 지다 when you conjugate them to give a completely different meaning. 춥다, for example, to be cold, can become 추워지다. That obviously couldn't be passive to be colded or something like that. No, this 지다, when attached to a descriptive verb, actually means to become, to get cold. 추워지다, like the weather became very cold. But not all passive verbs end with 지다. Many have their own forms already. But if a Korean isn't really familiar with passive voice and how to use it, they might assume that a verb needs 지다 at the end in order to be passive. And this is kind of the birth of double passive verbs. A really common example is the verb 쓰다. 쓰다 means to write or to use something, and the passive version of 쓰다 is just 쓰이다. But a Korean might hear 쓰이다 and think that it's something else. Maybe it's a causative verb, or they're just not so familiar with how to use it, so they might think, well, to make it very clear that I'm talking about passive, let's attach 지다 to the end, and you get something that looks like this. 쓰여지다. In fact, 쓰여지다 is even more commonly used than 쓰이다, despite being a double passive verb and completely wrong. But despite being wrong, you're still going to hear this one used a lot. So it's important to be aware of double passive verbs. So let's talk about the most commonly used double passive verbs. And these are only some of the common ones that you'll see, starting with 찢다, to rip or to tear, while the passive version of that is 찢기다, something is torn or ripped. Well, you'll more often actually hear the verb 찢겨지다, to be torn, but it's a double passive since these ones are already the passive. The next one is 보다, to see or to look, and that becomes passive as just 보이다, to be seen. Well, you'll also sometimes hear 보여지다, not as commonly as 보이다, I think, but you'll still see it sometimes. The next one is 하다, to do, becoming 되다, to become, and that can also become 되어지다 as the double passive form. 믿다, to believe or to trust, 믿기다, to be trusted, to be believed. Well, you might also find 믿겨지다. And finally, 잊다, to forget, can become 잊히다, to be forgotten. Or you might see 잊혀지다, to be forgotten. Now, there are a lot more than this, and I know this is already covering our entire screen. We could cover another few more screens with other common double passive verbs. I just wanted you to be aware that these sorts of things existed. So, were there any more that you can think of, any that I forgot? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time. 그럼 다음에 또 봐.